Hello, I'm Dr. John Cruz, and today I'm going to be talking about all falsehoods are not lies and what ADHD can teach us about deceit. So I'll be talking for about 20 minutes. If you have questions while I'm talking, you can type them in. I'll also try to get to them. We'll get to them later if you type them in on either YouTube or Facebook. So I usually start with the take-home message, and the take-home message is pretty simple on this one. So there is a lot of anecdotal claim that people with ADHD are both more honest than the average person, and also at the same time, people with ADHD are much more prone to lying, making things up, excusing things. Seems incompatible. What does the data show us? The data shows us virtually nothing. So I looked at PubMed trying to find articles about ADHD and lying, and the large majority of those articles that they had, there were 60 exactly, were about people lying about their ADHD in order to get stimulant medications. That says something about our society, that's the primary response there. And secondary responses to lying and ADHD had to do with or searching truthfulness or whether lying down affects your blood pressure differently if you have ADHD compared to the normal population. So not very relevant to our topic here. And also the topic of whether it's ethical to mislead people in placebo-controlled studies or sham treatment studies for ADHD. Also not what I'm trying to get at here. So there is a little bit of grounding in basic neurobiology that suggests two big reasons why people with ADHD may be more prone to lying. And this is going to be grossly oversimplifying and generalizing, but I think there's some validity to doing that. So two of the consistent findings in ADHD neurobiology is lower activation in the prefrontal cortex and lower activation of the anterior cingulate cortex in people with ADHD compared to age-matched controls. And the prefrontal cortex area seems to be one that's very important for impulse control. And if you have less active impulse control, one of the hallmark cluster of symptoms of ADHD is impulsivity. If you're impulsive, if you are less prone to censor what's going to come out of your mouth, if you're just going to spew whatever's at the top of your mind, you're prone both to saying more things that are untruthful, because someone who has more time or ability to stop, censor, look at what they're saying, think, oh my God, that's not true, I'm not going to say it. So impulsivity itself can lead to more untruthful statements coming out. In parallel, though, or in mirroring that, the impulsivity is what's also linked to the greater truth-tellingness in people with ADHD. So rather than considering the consequences of saying, yeah, that dress makes your butt look fat, or, hey, the emperor is not wearing any clothes, or any other number of statements that might be controversial or socially upsetting or may have ramifications outside of the mere factualness of uttering a statement, someone with ADHD is less likely to censor themselves, think ahead of why it might be problematic to give a straightforward answer and blurt out either a truthful answer or an untruthful answer. The anterior cingulate is, again, responsible for a host of activities, and then the ones that are particularly important here are integrating connections between emotions and cognition. Also, it's important for self-monitoring, and it's important for error detection. So when you get that little feeling, did I just put the wrong answer on the true-false question? And that's probably, at least in part, the anterior cingulate is good at detecting discrepancies, errors, something going on, even if consciously you're not able to sort through or think of what's going on. So having a less activated or weaker anterior cingulate cortex could therefore contribute to saying more statements that weren't error checked well enough or were inaccurate or were untrue. So again, that may be one reason why people with ADHD may be more prone to it. So I'm going to take a little side jump into conduct disorder. So particularly in kids, there's a condition we define as conduct disorder, and you have to have 3 persistent behaviors that are problematic, that are excessive for your age group. So many of these, and the conduct disorder bad behaviors, I'm sorry to use the word bad, but I will use it, fall into 4 different categories. So they can be aggressive things like bullying. Number 2 is vandalism, so bad activity towards inanimate objects. Category number 3 is lying and theft. So right there, part of conduct disorder includes people who are prone to or excessively lying or make a habitual pattern of lying. And 4 is other rule violations. So someone who wants to break the rules. So certainly conduct disorder is strongly associated with excessive lying, and conduct disorder is one of the conditions, and there are many, many that are comorbid with ADHD. So they happen more likely with ADHD than we would like to see them than we are likely to see them in the general population. So we know people with ADHD are more prone to depression, anxiety disorders, substance abuse disorders, but also conduct disorders, and maybe a correlate in adulthood, some personality disorders. So there's some purists who want to separate out everything into tidy little parcels and want to attribute, if there is excessive lying in ADHD, it may be more conduct disorder than the ADHD per se, and the other maybe more pragmatic or real world approach is that if this is commonly associated or a common feature of ADHD, you should be aware of it and expecting that it may be there and finding ways to deal with it. There was a recent study that used both some brain imaging and some executive function formal tests, and then some correlation studies, and they tried to separate out the extent of ADHD in the people's conduct disorder and the extent of their conduct disorder in their ADHD. And when they controlled for things or assessed them, the suggestion, and this is, I'm extrapolating beyond what they've actually claimed in their article, but was maybe the frontal anterior cingulate cortex really marks conduct, the extent of your conduct disorder, if you, again, control for the extent of ADHD in a kid. So again, maybe this weakened or less active anterior cingulate activity is more reflective of the element or degree of conduct disorder you have rather than your ADHD per se. So I'll leave that aside and then jump back to, aside from the neuroscience, behaviorally, why might people with ADHD tell the truth or tell untruths more often? So we talked about impulsivity. If you're not censoring what you're saying, more untruths may come out. We also talked about poor error detection. If you're less good at even sorting out whether it's true or false, more errors, more untrue statements may come out. Number 3 is, if there are impairments in working memory, you may well forget what went on before and therefore have less true information to answer to it. So if your wife asks, "Oh, Joe, when you left the house this morning, did you turn off the coffee maker?" If you don't have in your working memory and you know what kind of answer she wants, or you don't want to look bad, guilty, stupid, you may invent an answer because you don't have a real truthful answer in your working memory. And related to that is inattentiveness. So if you didn't process the information to begin with, if you're just nodding your head when someone's saying, "Yes, we're going out to dinner with the Joneses next week at 6 o'clock and make sure you're home from work on time," yeah. If you didn't really process the information. And then when someone confronts you later is, why weren't you ready? Why weren't you on time? You're more likely to respond, well, you never told me. That may be actually your real experience, even though you're sitting there shaking your head. So again, an untruth may come out. I'm going to get in a minute to how I want to classify untruths. And another reason that's postulated for some potential untruths is that many people with ADHD require greater stimulation for arousal, to make their brain happy, and there may be a stimulating, arousing effect of telling a lie. It's exciting. You get to be more creative. You might get a rise out of people. So that has also been postulated or suggested as a reason people with ADHD may be more prone to tell untruths. So what I think is really important before sort of labeling all these people liars, which I'll get to, we shouldn't be doing anyway, is that we're mixing up three very different types of untruths or falsehoods. So I like to divide it, and there are more than 20 different types of lies. If you look at Wikipedia or others, there's white lies and black lies and red lies and whopping lies and pathological lying. But I'm going to divide untruths into three categories. One is simple falsehoods. So those are things that are untrue, but I would say are not lies because there was no intent to deceive. There may not even be any awareness that the statement that was uttered was untrue. I'll give some examples after. The second category is what I call reflexive lies. And this is, I think, the area where people with ADHD are particularly prone to slip into. So that is when they're confronted in the heat of a situation, they're caught either without information or that they did something wrong, and their immediate response is to create a story we'll get into why, to lie reflexively. So it's a reflex, it's instantaneous. And then the third category of lies are what I call reflective lies, or what we often call premeditated lies. So those are something where you know you did something wrong, you're planning to do something wrong, or you're trying to deceive someone, or you're trying to manipulate them, and you come up with and conjure up an elaborate story ahead of time with the intent, you know it's wrong, you know it's false, and you know you're trying to deceive someone. So that, I would say, is ethically the worst kind of lie of these three categories. And people with ADHD are actually particularly poor at reflective lies, premeditated lies, for a couple of reasons. Not that nobody with ADHD ever told one that pulled it off successfully, but what does a reflective, premeditated lie require? One, it requires planning. You have to think ahead, you have to consider. Two, it requires good memory and good attention to detail so that you don't trip yourself up, that you don't screw up. Three, it requires good emotional regulation so you don't tip off people by an excessive emotional response or even being too flat or too cool when you're telling that lie. So the reflective lies, the premeditated lies, I think are actually underrepresented in people with ADHD because they're not very good at them. Again, this is largely conjectural or a collection of anecdotal information from years of working in this field. So I said I'd give some examples. So falsehood, an example of a falsehood would have been when Donald Trump said, oh, COVID, you can inject bleach under your skin or you can shine UV lights on it. Is it untrue? Certainly at that time that any of those were proven effective treatments. Absolutely, it's a falsehood. Might there be kernels of prospective areas of research involved? Potentially. Was he uttering it with the intent to deceive people? I would claim, again, I'm not inside his head, but absolutely not. And I would say just looking at the sentence structure and how he was speaking, he was rambling. He was shooting off the top of his head. This was an impulsive, just blurting out what he was thinking. When Donald Trump wants his followers to do certain things, he speaks in simple, imperative, declarative sentences, usually 3 words or fewer. Lock her up, build the wall, stop the steal. That's not rambling about bleach and UV lights and skin and getting rid of COVID. So jumping back to the category reflexive lies, which I think people with ADHD are more prone to doing, and I would say the big mediator of that is shame. So people with ADHD are often shamed that they've made a mistake. So they're caught, there's wet cement and they weren't looking at the sign and they walked into the wet cement and they're caught in that. And they're saying, why did you just step into the cement? And often they reflect, oh, I didn't do that. Or, oh, I had bubble gum on my shoe and had to get it off, or something that's usually not terribly plausible, not terribly believable, but the shame at acknowledging that they made a mistake and error pushes them into a sort of trying to defend themselves in a way that's not particularly defensive. And this type of reflexive lie often feeds into doubling down, or even expounding on it when you're caught. Well, there's no bubble gum on your shoe. Oh, well, it's special bubble gum that dissolves when you touch concrete with your foot. So of course you can't see it now. And so they have a propensity to get more and more preposterous. Other sources of shame are shame at not understanding the question. If you're not paying attention, if you're inattentiveness and someone calls on you, you may try to cover up and create a lie to hide the fact that you don't even know what they're really asking you about. Similarly, shame at forgetting something. So I brought, the example earlier, did you turn off the coffee machine? And you may not even be able to remember whether you did or not, but you're going to say right away, yeah, I did it. I always do it. And shame at not even knowing what you might have missed. So not just shame at forgetting. Also shame at not being able to stay on track. So, little Joe started his homework and then there was an interesting text from his friend, and that led to them playing video games, and he never got his homework done. And dad calls upstairs, have you done your homework yet? And there's shame at getting off track and not doing the homework, and knowing he also potentially could get in trouble for not having done his homework. So he says, yeah, I finished all of it. It's ready to go for school next day. So shame can be a big driver of reflexive lies. Two other potential sources or contributors psychologically to reflexive lies are just avoiding doing a boring task. So people with ADHD do not do well, particularly with boring tasks. And so, oh, it's your turn to do the dishes. And right away, the aversion to doing that is so high that it's easy to come up with, oh, my doctor said I have this fingernail infection. I can't get in hot water with it. Or some other lie to get out of. Again, it's not premeditated. They weren't thinking, oh, it's my turn to do the dishes, or we usually share this task and I'm going to be asked to do it. It wasn't a planned response. It was a spur of the moment response. And this is mostly written about in children, but I think there are certainly some adults I've seen this where it appeared to be a factor, is what's called magical thinking. And that is the child or adult will lie to undo the badness of what's going on. So the kid's caught drawing with his crayons on the wall, and they're standing there with the crayons, and the mother comes in and sees them, and did you do that? No, the dog did it. I didn't do it. So it's an attempt to undo what's been done in a magical way. It can't really happen. And again, it may not be exactly shame-based here. It may be more, they realize this is bad. They wish that, they don't want to make their mom angry. They didn't want this to happen, but it's so in a similar vein. I've had couples who were separating or divorcing or undergoing other conflict. And even in the session, I've heard one partner with ADHD call their spouse a fool or an asshole, some horrible name. And 5 minutes later, when the partner says, I was really hurt when you called me these names, and say, I didn't say that. And again, it could be forgetting, not being aware of what they actually said, or it could be at some deeper level of magical thinking that they were angry in that moment and maybe thought or felt what they're thinking. And right now they are not thinking or feeling that, and therefore don't even want to believe or want to undo what they said in that different state. So there are a multitude of shame and other based psychological reasons making reflexive lying more prominent, I think, in people with ADHD than in the general population. Certainly it's not everyone with ADHD. And running quickly with how do we deal with lying, and this is both how the person without ADHD, particularly a parent confronting a child, but also the person themselves with ADHD. I think the steps are sort of similar. One is confronting it when it happens. So it's not letting it slide, not letting it go. So that's the parent. And confronting doesn't mean blaming. It doesn't mean labeling the kid as a liar or the fellow adult, because that all that serves to do is decrease their motivation to telling the truth in the future. So it's to try to use reflective understanding, saying, I understand you were ashamed or you're surprised when I caught you with the crayon writing on the wall. So again, not labeling them necessarily bad or evil or wrong, because again, some of these, again, we're not talking about reflective, premeditated lies here. We're talking about mostly reflexive lies. The second thing is to have consequences. So if you are a parent saying, your consequence for telling a lie about this, separate from, there may be an added consequence to just having to clean up or remediate the mess on the wall, because again, you compounded it by telling an untruth about it, but to try to make it correlated with the severity of the badness or in your mind. So it's not to escalate further or make a criminal case, even though often parents will think that there's a pattern of that they need to correct or over browbeat the kid for. So part of this is, and then being consistent. So again, and if you're monitoring yourself, it's trying to call yourself out each time you do it, not let some of them pass or some of them go. Similar if you're a parent. But part of what I'm moving towards here is that these lies are always interactions between someone. Again, we're talking about someone with ADHD and the world around them. And that means that the world around them is probably having some role in what's going on. So I'll bring up two examples of this. I had a parent, very engaged, sincere, single father, taking care of two kids, older kids, about 10 years old with ADHD, has been reprimanded several times in school for making a disturbance in the class, throwing paper airplanes. He's done it just now for the fourth time, even though his desk is right near the teacher, and the school's blanket policy is for the kid to, that evening, write an essay of what they did wrong and why they did it and why they chose to disrupt the class. And this kid was not doing this homework assignment to remediate this, and that dad got mad thinking the kid was just trying to avoid it or not think about it. And I pointed out that maybe the kid hadn't been thinking at all at the moment that it would be disruptive to the class. Maybe the kid's ADD reaction was more, I'm really bored with this lesson, and this is a piece of paper in front of me, and I know 7 different ways of making paper airplanes, which are really cool, so I'm going to launch one and send it. So the request of the system for him to explain why he thought that disrupting the teacher in the classroom was superior to minding his own business just is not a sensible question to be asking this kid to do. Another example, when I was monitoring playground for my kid 15 years, maybe not 15 years ago, more than 10. So 2 girls, 9 years old, one kid is showing off her karate moves. She spins around. Both kids here have ADHD, spins around, isn't paying attention to how close people were, what's going on, kicks the other kid. So kid number 2, inattentive ADD, just wanders into the middle of this group without paying attention. So gets kicked in the middle of the chest. And right away, the school monitor rushes up. They've just been learning a conflict resolution lesson in classes. So everyone sits around, and all the witnesses, all the participants have to talk about why they chose to act on their anger in this moment and what was really getting them angry and what they can do next time in a more healthy, constructive way. And both kids, the kid who was kicked was not asked to describe she was angry. Both kids involved actually knew exactly what had happened. Neither of them were particularly bothered by it. The kid who was kicked, was apologizing almost as much for getting in the way as the kid who had kicked. But to ask them to explain their anger, this wasn't an act that had happened out of anger, but you're almost forcing them to lie to come up with an explanation that fits your formula for that. So that's about all I'll say. So again, I do think there are certain forms of untruths, which I would call reflexive lies, that are more likely in people with ADHD, but some of that is attributable to impulsivity and attentiveness, other aspects of how an ADD brain works, but some of it is also due to society expecting formulaic, or thinking they know why certain things are happening if they're bad things, and that someone must have premeditated and blamed it. So that's all I'll say for today. I'm not seeing any questions right now. Have a good Thanksgiving, and next week I'll be talking about monitoring sleep. So bye for now.